My sentence initially should have ended this past October, but here I am. The Canadian government has put this court in a position where it has to enforce a judgment and a ruling that was derived from torture, the same torture that the Canadian government has apologized for. This is not the first time my life has been held in suspension, and I'm going to continue to fight this injustice. And thankfully, we have an actual court system that has actual rules and laws.
That was former Guantanamo Bay detainee Omar Khadr speaking outside of an Edmonton court today. The 32-year-old is seeking a Canadian passport to travel to Saudi Arabia, and he wants permission to speak to his sister. With more on the story, the CBC's Janice Johnston joins me from Edmonton. Hey, Janice, thanks for doing this. Really appreciate your time. My pleasure. What more can you tell me about why Khadr was in court today?
Well, I think you heard a little bit of that just now from Mr. Khadr, where he said, my life is in suspension, and it's not the first time. And that's essentially what's going on. Khadr, at age 32, feels like his life has been put on hold, that it's causing him great psychological anxiety and depression, because everything is waiting for an appeal down in the States to happen, and there's been absolutely no movement on that. For that reason, that's why he sought some lightening of his bail conditions, permission to get a passport so he could do a pilgrimage to Mecca, and permission to speak to his sister without any sort of supervision. I should mention that the crowns for both the province and the federal government opposed those changes, so the judge has delayed making a decision on that. We're going to hear from her a week from tomorrow at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
And that sister, of course, was a controversial character throughout his trial and ordeal, I guess you could call it. I understand there's no end in sight. You mentioned the case in the States, Mr. Khadr's case in the state. What does that mean?
Well, it means that right now, Mr. Khadr is on bail, and that has an indefinite ending because it's bail pending appeal. What Nate Whitling, Khadr's lawyer, wants to do is instead get parole for Mr. Khadr. He's applied for permission to the parole board to have a hearing. So far, he's been turned down because the parole board says, well, you're not in custody, so we can't give you a parole hearing. So he's trying to do a little bit of legal maneuvering here, and he's also asking the Edmonton Court of Queen's Bench Justice to sign an order that will say this: when Mr. Khadr gets a parole board hearing, the bail conditions are revoked immediately at the start of that hearing. Now, let's say the parole board decides that they don't want to render a decision immediately, or else they turn him down for parole. He wants the judge here to say, if that happens, then the bail conditions go back on. So he's trying to sort of work it out either way. And the judge said, I've never seen anything like this before. I've got to think about this, hence the delay.
Okay, thank you so much, Janice. That's the CBC's Janice Johnston in Edmonton for us. And just to remind our viewers, Omar Khadr, of course, the federal government agreed to a $10.5 million settlement with Khadr back in July of 2017. It was a very controversial decision, essentially made to resolve his civil suit over allegations of mistreatment and breaches of his charter rights.